Welcome to 99 zu 1, an English interview today. That's why I'm speaking English. And this is a pre-recording. A couple of patrons are joining us in the chat. But this broadcast is probably going to happen a week after the recording. So you guys will already have heard something about Platypus Affiliated Society. We had the interview with Stefan Hein, which was broadcasted last Sunday. And today we are talking with Chris Cutrone, actually the founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society. And I'll bring in Chris Cutrone right away. Welcome to 99 zu 1, Chris.
Thanks.
Was I correct in saying that you are the founder, the founder of Platypus?
Yes, in a curious kind of way. So I was the teacher of the students who started the organization. And so my students from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, as well as from the University of Chicago, a mixture of grad students and undergraduates, asked me to do a reading group. And so we started a reading group, and then that became Platypus. And obviously they relied on a lot of guidance from me in that process, but it kind of wouldn't have happened without them. And so they really founded it, but I was the sort of, leader. When we founded the organization, they elected me president so I could handle organizational responsibilities and that kind of thing. And like I said, I started out as their teacher and I kind of remained in that role. But now it's, I'm no longer president and I'm not even on the leadership body anymore. So.
Okay, got it. Chris, I have a weird crackling noise in your audio. Is there something you can do about that? Do you know where it's
coming? Right? Okay. How's that?
Oh, perfect. Much clearer.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Chris, then let me maybe give you a short introduction and you correct what I'm getting wrong here. So I tried to click this together through the interweb. So Chris Cutrone teaches art history, theory and criticism, and visual and critical studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and social sciences at the University of Chicago, where he completed his PhD, which he wrote on Adorno's Marxism. As we already said, he's the original organizer and founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society. He is also a regular guest at Doug Lane's Diet Soap Media, whom we also had in an interview here already. He's the author of various articles, contrarian political commentaries, such as one that got quite famous was this "Why Not Trump" article at the beginning of the Trump presidency, or before it actually. And recently, this article, "The Dictatorship of the Proletariat and the Death of the Left," which we are going to talk about today. Chris, is there anything that you would like to say regarding your introduction, or did I miss something or get something wrong?
So I was teaching at the University of Chicago for a long time, but not most recently, because they changed the environment for teaching there. I was hired by my old professor, Moishe Postone, who has some profile on the German left.
Oh, yes.
And, but after Moishe retired, and then after he also passed away, then there began a kind of a purge of his students from the faculty. And I was a victim of that.
Okay. Was that that's interesting. Right. And that rival was a Marxist professor too, or
no? I'm sure he thinks of himself as some kind of a leftist, but not a Marxist. No.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's interesting content for another episode.
Yeah.
So, Chris, you recently wrote this article called "The Dictatorship of the Proletariat and the Death of the Left." And before we start explaining these concepts, the title consists basically of two concepts, which seem unrelated at first, like this idea of Marxist dictatorship of the proletariat and the platypus framework of the death of the left, right? Which we explored last week with Stefan Hein. What's the relationship there? What role does the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat play in the death of the left?
Okay, so one goal of that essay, and it's the beginning of like a small book that I'm writing, is to kind of conceptually clarify the meaning of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But I also have to take upon myself an explanation of how the concept has become unclear. In other words, that there are real historical and political reasons why the dictatorship of the proletariat has now become a kind of an obscure concept. Even though it was central to Marxism, it actually was not a mystery back 100 years ago the way it is now. And so in that respect, I had to say, that the death of the left is responsible for the obscuring of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but also the abandonment of that original Marxist political vision of the dictatorship of the proletariat contributed to the death of the left. So they're interrelated phenomena at this point in time, right? So in the early 21st century, when we're thinking about the fate of Marxism, I've kind of recentered how we define Marxism, that what makes Marxism different from any other political ideology and any other theory, any other perspective, is it's what Marx called recognition of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the historical, social, political necessity of that as a prospect, right? And so that is what distinguishes Marxism from other forms of socialism. It's what's controversial about Marxism. And it's also what is misrepresented by Marxism, both by its adherents and by its detractors, right? So it is a kind of a funny taboo or fetish concept. And,
yeah, definitely.
And so all of that is a kind of a symptom of the historical fate of, and the left is a little bit of a euphemism. What I mean by that is proletarian socialism, the socialist vision in the era of capitalism. So, that to me is what defines the left. Although obviously in colloquial terms, it has a broader definition, and there's also a kind of a history to that. In other words, when did the meaning of the left no longer mean socialism? How did that happen?
Right. You just started crackling again in the last sentence.
Oh boy.
And now it's clean. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Pardon me. Go ahead.
All good. Okay, let's try again. Let's keep going, right? Come to the next question. Okay, good. Can you then maybe tell us a little bit about the etymology of the term? I hope it's pronounced like this, etymology. How, when, under which circumstances was it invented? How to understand the word dictatorship? Because I think that's also one of the most contentious aspects of this discussion, right?
Okay, so both words in the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat have their origins in the ancient Roman Republic, right? So the proletariat refers to the class of Roman citizens in terms of representation in the Senate, to give representation to Romans who did not have property. Right, so they were the propertyless Romans, but they were still Roman citizens. They were tribally Roman, right? Because that's the way ancient civilizations are. They're very tribal. And so that's the proletari. And that term was not original to Marx in terms of referring to the modern industrial working class, or the working class under conditions of the Industrial Revolution. You don't have to be like an industrial factory worker to be part of the proletariat. But it does refer to the idea that the workers had become expropriated of their property in capitalism. in the industrial phase of capitalism specifically, with the Industrial Revolution, that workers were no longer selling their labor as a commodity or the products of their labor as a commodity. They didn't, in a sense, possess their own social property as workers anymore. Although apparently we still do. We enter into labor contracts. But in reality, we don't, according to Marx. And so we are proletarianized under capitalism. That's the idea. Now, so like the situation of the ancient Roman Republic, where there are citizens and they have rights and they have representation, but they're without property. And of course, property in bourgeois society is different from property in ancient Rome. So property in ancient Rome was land, and it was the land of conquest. Whereas now, the property is we're self-possessing individuals, we own ourselves, we belong to ourselves, we have inalienable rights to ourselves as our own property. And what we do with our time and our bodies and our energy belongs to us. Our labor is our property. And John Locke, the idea is that property is not based on possession or conquest, it's based on labor. So you can make a claim to anything that you've worked on as your property. So the idea is that we've lost that. We've become proletarianized in capitalism, in industrial capitalism, in the 1800s. That had been observed by others, not just by Marx, but Marx does take up that notion of a proletarianized working class, as opposed to an artisanal bourgeois working class, like you had coming out of the Renaissance. Mm-hmm. So dictatorship, and of course that's the one, right, that really kind of, although proletariat is also a controversial term, like people do deny that there is proletarianization.
Right.
So bourgeois conservatives, liberals, conservative liberals, maybe progressive liberals admit that there is such a thing as proletarianization. But more conservative-minded people will kind of deny that proletarianization exists. They'll say, no, people have not been stripped of their property and their rights in society. That has not happened. We're still freely contracting individuals. We're still bourgeois subjects. So that's proletariat is controversial too. We shouldn't neglect that. It's not just dictatorship that's controversial. But dictatorship goes back to the ancient Republic of Rome as well. And it's Julius Caesar. It's the role that the Senate could elect a dictator and basically imbue that dictator with all the rights of the Senate to overrule the Senate and to suspend law and rights of people in an emergency situation.
During wartime or so, right?
In wartime especially, because obviously the ancient world is all about war, and ancient Rome is, of course, all about war. So that is the main emergency, but there, other potential circumstances, including, kind of political breakdown, political chaos, which is also understood as war, by the way, right? Because the citizens, they're really kind of an aristocracy. They're the warrior caste. That's how they got their property, right? And then they fight each other, so whenever there are elections in ancient Rome, there's also street fighting. The families hire people to go kill each other, and that's democracy. That is democracy, and we still do that now, right? We just have a more refined way of doing it, and a more dishonest way of doing it. But that's democracy. It's gang warfare. Right. Dictatorship is meant to respond to an emergency, to do what's necessary, and sometimes what's necessary is not according to the Constitution or the law. Sometimes it involves violating people's rights. Okay, so Marx thought that capitalism is such that it will produce crises that will necessitate dictatorship. And it will either be a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or it will be a dictatorship of the proletariat. So the idea is that the capitalist state is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And it violates liberal democracy, it violates bourgeois right, including of the capitalist class, right? So politicians will arrest their enemies. They'll find some way of twisting the law, twisting the constitutional order to do what's necessary. They'll be dishonest about it. Occasionally they'll be honest about it. And that's when another term that is relevant here, Bonapartism, pertains. And that doesn't refer to Napoleon Bonaparte. It refers rather to Louis Bonaparte. So it refers to the result of the 1848 revolutions. And Bonapartism was how Marx understood the capitalist state and what necessities the capitalist state had to respond to in industrial capitalism and the crisis of society in industrial capitalism. So he saw the rise of Louis Bonaparte in the Revolution of 1848 in France, first elected as president and then suspending the National Assembly and declaring himself emperor, and then establishing the Second Empire for 2 decades. But Marx also saw Bonapartism in Bismarck in Germany. So Bismarck in Germany was also for Marx a Bonapartist. And Bismarck gives us a kind of a pithy formulation about this. He said of the revolution of 1848, he said that we learned from the revolution of 1848 that the big questions of today will not be solved through great assemblies and fine speeches, but by blood and iron, by force, right? And Marx accepted that. That's true. According to Marx, that's true, right? The great questions of the day under capitalism will be solved not democratically, but through state fiat and through force. And that's Bonapartism. It's the capitalist state. And though nominally liberal and democratic, so he also saw this, by the way, in Britain, in the parliamentary leadership and the prime ministers, Palmerston and Disraeli, who declared Queen Victoria Empress of India. And that had more to do with domestic British politics than it had to do with India and colonialism, right? So that brings in another term, imperialism. What's meant by imperialism? Imperialism is the capitalist state. It's not really about colonization. Right. It's about the imperial state. And then colonialism under capitalism is a kind of projection of the imperial state internationally. Right? So again, the idea being that capitalism necessitates dictatorship, but in a way that's less honest than in the ancient Roman Republic, that can still pretend to be liberal democracy and still pretend to observe civil rights, but in practice actually violates it necessarily in order to maintain and manage capitalism. This has to happen. So his vision of the dictatorship of the proletariat is that if the working class comes to power through revolution, which is what he expected, a political crisis of the state necessitating a profound political change and maybe a constitutional change as well, that the workers would inherit the same necessity that capitalism creates. In other words, the dictatorship of the proletariat will still be ruling over capitalism. That's another big deal, right? So it's still capitalism, it's not socialism. And therefore, the workers will have to exercise the same kind of political authority and emergency measures that the capitalist state does now in the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Okay? But the idea being that the way the workers would exercise that would not be through like a state bureaucracy and through like capitalist corporations who are like cronies of the politicians, right? Through that kind of racket kind of system, but rather it would be exercised through the workers' own organizations. So it would be exercised through like labor unions, workers' militias, right? All the civil social organizations that the working class builds up for itself under capitalism, that will be the basis of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it will be the workers' own organizations that replace the capitalist, bourgeois, civil social organizations and state bureaucracy. So the idea is that it would be democratic by comparison to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and by comparison with the capitalist state kind of bureaucratic Bonapartism. The dictatorship of the proletariat will be much more democratic. democratic, maybe not liberal, right? Meaning that, again, even though it aims towards the emancipation of society and towards the realization of everyone's rights, that the transition to socialism might necessitate emergency measures that will mean violating people's rights. In the same way that under capitalism, the capitalist state violates people's rights. Right? So this is just to sort of demystify the concept, right? Now, in the 20th century, of course, there were states that emerged out of revolutionary change that claimed to be the dictatorship of the proletariat, like the Soviet Union, communist China today. If you go to, if you talk Marxism with the Chinese Communist Party, if I were to go to the Politburo or the Presidium and say, okay, guys, what's going on here? They would say, this is the dictatorship of the proletariat. We're managing the transition to socialism. And yeah, we sometimes have to violate people's rights, but it's because, we're doing what's necessary to achieve socialism. So what about that, right? Doesn't look very appealing. Doesn't look.
They even have that in their manifesto that they consider the transition to socialism. Whoa.
Hold on one second, Nadim.
Yeah.
You kind of became noisy there.
You also crackled up again. Then it got a little bit better. That's why I didn't say anything.
Okay, now I can hear you more clearly, but you got really crackly there. Go ahead.
All right. That's weird. Never happened before. Bad luck. Yeah, in China, it's even like part of their official agenda to say that to openly admit that they don't say that they are already in socialism.
Right.
Actually, that they even don't envision the transition to socialism to happen before 2050, I think, or 2049 was the year.
Right.
Something like that. Yeah. So.
Which is itself demagogic, meaning when we come around to 2050, if they're still in power in China, they'll say, well, we're not there yet.
Right. I mean, that seems to be like this kind of implicit issue in this formulation, right? But okay, we get to that in a second, I think. So the purpose of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to, seize the means of the state and start the transition to socialism. That will be a messy situation. It will not be already great for everyone. Yes, we will also have to confine people maybe, or cut on their civil liberties. In your article, you, together with Marx, Engels, but also others like Lenin, Luxemburg, stress that the struggle for communism explicitly must be constituted in its first instance in the struggle for the dictatorship of the proletariat. So my question here would be now, why is there just this one way to Rome? What's the reasoning here that there is, for example, not a parliamentary road that we can take? I mean, there were people in the beginning of the 20th century that were then actually adopting this worldview, right?
So there might be, by the way. In other words, it's not ruled out by Marx, Engels, Lenin, or Luxemburg, or Trotsky and others. And by the Second International more generally, sometimes people like Karl Kautsky and August Bebel are seen as like equivocating or kind of obfuscating on the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. No, you could have a parliamentary road to socialism. You could. In other words, you could have the election of a socialist party in a majority in, a democratic election. The idea, though, is that the capitalists are not going to accept that, right? Like, they'll probably try to have a coup of some kind. And, even if it's not a coup or a military takeover, although that's the most likely thing, I think people even threaten that about Jeremy Corbyn. I think people in the British military even said if Jeremy Corbyn's elected, we might have to oust him because he will be breaking NATO, right? And so we can't allow that, and so we might, people actually said, we might have to overthrow him militarily if he insists on getting out of NATO. But, also just more generally, like in society, in civil society, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists and maybe a lot of middle-class people and maybe a lot of working-class people and maybe the lumpen proletariat will resist, the transition to socialism. That's possible. And so even though you could be elected to office, you might still have to take measures, right? In the same way that elected governments now have to take measures to maintain power. And they do, right? So I think that the ideal situation would be to have as little of that exercise of force, as possible. And in other words, the greater the majority, the greater the working class majority, and also others who are not part of the working class proper necessarily, but who support socialism, the more support you can get, then the least force will have to be used. And the shorter the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat will be. Right? So, a couple of things we have to bear in mind is that the vision was that several of the metropolitan advanced capitalist countries would have to come under the control of the dictatorship of the proletariat immediately, right? Like very in short order. That without that, you couldn't have a transition to socialism. And so it kind of would cease to be the dictatorship of the proletariat as a transition to socialism, and it would just become another emergency government of capitalism, but with a working class base. Right, so then it wouldn't really have the true historical content of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It would just be a workers' government, but it would remain a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie because it would be forced by circumstance to manage capitalism rather than transition to socialism. And of course, that's what the Chinese Communist Party does.
Right.
And that's what the Soviet Union did too, although more obscurely, because obviously the Chinese Communist Party, they developed capitalism on the basis of foreign trade and foreign investment, in a way that the Soviet Union did very little of that. It did do some of that, but it did less of that. So it's more obscure how the Soviet Union basically was ruled by the Communist Party in the interests of capitalism. Not like domestic capitalism, but to fit into a world order of continued capitalism, right? So it's a more obscure and mediated point to say that the Soviet Union was not the dictatorship of the proletariat, although it claimed to be and wanted to be. It never really was. So the reason that there were things like the Second International, the Socialist International, is that these people thought of themselves, these parties, they were like one world party of socialism, and they thought of their congresses, their meetings every few years, and their constant interaction and cooperation with each other. They thought that they were a government in waiting. They thought that they were an international government in waiting. And that they would take power in several countries in Europe and the United States, like within a short period of time, maybe just take a few years to get, for everybody to come to power together. And then of course at that time, before World War I, Britain and France and even Germany, they had colonies, right? So they would immediately take over 80% of the world. That would be that, right? In which case this emergency government would be pretty quick and transitory. It wouldn't last decades. No. It would last years.
We kind of messed that up.
Sure.
No, I guess the SPD, at least, the war bonds is
the war messed it up. Look, the capitalists, politicians, the conservatives, they didn't just sit there and just watch the growth of socialism, right? They took action, So they had a plan. In Germany they had a plan. They were gonna, in 1912, the SPD achieved the largest vote it had ever achieved, and it achieved the ability to basically block things in Parliament, in the Reichstag, and which was important because even though it wasn't a democracy at all, it was a Prussian absolutist state, they still needed the Reichstag to approve money, because the bourgeoisie cares about money, right? They don't care about the form of political rule. They care, is the government going to pay us back if if loans are floated? if we finance the government, is it a good proposition or not? So they demanded at least that, some purse string control. And so once the SPD in 1912 achieved the height of its like Reichstag parliamentary democratic electoral influence, then the Prussian state was like, we got to do something about this. And so they started thinking about how they could use a little war to split the SPD. And of course, there were these Balkan wars, like leading up to World War One, but they needed a little bit of a greater kind of emergency. They needed something that they could threaten the German working class with Russia. They needed to have a situation where it looks like if the government isn't supported in the war, then Russia might invade. Right? So they used a term by Bebel, or a phrase by Bebel. He said, not one penny, not one man for this rotten system. But if it's Russia, I myself will pick up the rifle. Right? And he died in 1913. That's another factor. Maybe if he hadn't died, things would have gone a little differently. Also, Jean Jaurès, who was the leader of the French Socialist Party, who was a kind of eclectic, heterodox, not really a Marxist, but a kind of quasi-Marxist. He was assassinated by French nationalists right before World War I. And if he had not been, the French might have had a more difficult time prosecuting that war. I mean, people do matter. Individuals matter. Political organizations matter. And, the conservatives kind of very deliberately, intentionally killed the Second International. And with the Germans in particular, they were trying to, kill the SPD through a war that was meant to be quick. But instead it became World War I, a total disaster.
Right.
So, and they were successful. Marxists consider World War I to have been a preemptive counter-revolution against the socialist movement. That's what it was.
Yep.
If the SPD didn't exist, World War I would not have happened the way it did.
Right. And
right.
probably
so that's the other thing.
World War II too. Right.
Oh, absolutely. Right. So in other words, that opened up a whole era. Right. Exactly. Of which again, Marxists more or less desperately tried to treat the whole period between World War I and World War II as a protracted revolutionary situation. A situation of world revolution. And it kind of looks like that, especially because of what happens after World War II with Eastern Europe and China and Korea and Vietnam. It does look like, and also in other places like Iran has a little moment at the end of World War II. It really looks like, okay, this is the continuation of the world revolution that started at the end of World War I. So it becomes a rather obscure point how and why that was not the case. Right? And that's the vexed issue of Stalinism and, and the degeneration of the Third International and communism, which is a long process. And, but basically that when people hear dictatorship, they hear Stalinism.
Absolutely.
And then people recall the anarchist critiques of Marxism back in the day, that Bakunin said about Marx and Engels. Well, they call for the dictatorship of the proletariat, but they're really the dictators of the proletariat, Marx and Engels. And so it becomes hard to refute. Like, doesn't it seem like history bore that out? And so, again, it's like, well, okay, maybe the anarchists are right, and maybe the liberals are right, Socialism is inevitably a, totalitarian nightmare, and this and that. Maybe, right? That's possible, right? It has not been proven that the dictatorship of the proletariat is going to lead us to socialism. Right? But we do have to understand why Marxists might have thought so. Right? How they understood that.
What we do have, though, we have proof that the idea or the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat led to what we would today call, like in a liberal sense, would call real dictatorships, in the sense of, you know, gulags, death squads, like Stalinist repression, all this stuff. So we do have actually proof for that. Is it then not at least clear that there is apparently an inherent danger in this concept, that it can go that way, or is it related to other parameters?
I think that it is a danger, right? So, I mean, basically the way I think about it is, capitalism is a dangerous situation, clearly, right? So we have revolutions, we have civil wars, we have international wars, we have a great deal of bloody conflict and violence since the 1840s, right? So, you know, after the Napoleonic Wars, you know, there is a kind of a new phase of history with the Industrial Revolution. And yet there is this desire, there is a goal for a global cosmopolitan order of peace, you know, of bourgeois democracy and equality between nations, all of this good stuff, right? And so just taking Marxism out of the picture, taking socialism out of the picture, like just take all that out of the picture. The question is, why has that not happened? Why have we not had an international bourgeois liberal democracy of peace, right, of commercial relations between peoples? Why not? What's prevented that from happening? The only explanation that the capitalist ideologues have for that is like human nature. People are too nationalistic, they're too tribalistic.
Selfish beings or something else.
Selfish, particularistic, you know, that actually, you know, turns out that like group affinity is stronger than bourgeois social relations of trade and commerce and labor cooperation between nations, right? So it becomes this kind of battle for the soul of humanity, like which tendency is going to win? Is it going to be like the peaceful cooperative soul, or is it going to be the tribal warring soul? They don't really have an explanation. They don't.
That's
right. For why this,
that's what that
right. For why this hasn't worked out, they don't have an explanation. And so, you know, again, Marxism does have an explanation. And that explanation is that capitalism disintegrates bourgeois society and it creates conditions of competition that are negative and destructive, that are not about like just improving things and finding new ways of doing things. You know, like there's a beneficial side to competition, of course there is. It drives people to excellence. But there's a kind of a zero-sum game, a destructive kind of competition that capitalism itself generates. At least as a countervailing tendency. There is a tendency towards international cooperation and the brotherhood of peoples, definitely, and the overcoming of national particularity. That's still an ongoing process. That's still happening, right? The world is still being brought together by bourgeois social relations and by cooperative labor. But there's a countervailing tendency, and that countervailing tendency is how the workers are pitted against each other in competition, right? And not just internationally, but within countries, you know, high-wage workers versus low-wage workers, men versus women, old versus young, right? And people will try to get advantage in that competition, and sometimes that will create group affinity. And national states are also functions of competition within the working class at a global scale. So at a global scale, ultimately, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie still has to answer to the working class. At times, maybe not consistently all the time, but at crucial moments, it has to answer to the working class. It has to answer to the deplorables and the irredeemables, right? That sometimes the people are just going to say, you know what? No. And then the capitalist state's going to have to respond to them. And the way they will respond is through international competition. And that will sometimes lead to violent conflict and war, right? And it will create sectarian, communitarian violence within countries. You know, there's been a lot of that over the last 2 centuries. it will just pit people against each other. You know, it will pit capitalists against each other too, and states, but it will just pit workers against each other. It will. And that will undermine the spirit of cooperation that is otherwise generated by the society. Right, so...
Yeah. This analysis, especially today, is like, it's like so important. So if we talk to people here on the left, I mean, I guess it's the same in the US, but, you know, looking at Ukraine and Russia, having this kind of rather like it's in communist circles that I know of, like from my father in the past, this was a given. Like capitalism breeds war. It's just like these two are like connected like that. That seems to be forgotten even on, you know, Marxist sites, like people that call themselves Marxists and maybe even have read one or two things over there. So yeah, it's really depressing.
A lot of basic truths, if you will, about the modern world are forgotten, and they're kind of forgotten generationally, you know, and especially critical truths, like negative truths, right? So, you know, every new generation wakes up and thinks, oh, well, that was our grandfathers and our fathers. They made those mistakes, but we're not going to make that mistake again. You know, we know better now. We've learned the lessons of history. Turns out they haven't, right? And again, from a Marxist perspective, it's like the lesson of history is not just like war and nationalism. The lesson of history is capitalism, right? Until we get this capitalism thing dealt with, we're going to have these problems. So, you know, how it relates to dictatorship of the proletariat is that there are going to be civil wars and revolutions too. There's not only going to be international war, there's going to be civil war and revolution within even advanced capitalist states that are wealthy. It just will happen. Guaranteed to happen. Right? And so the issue is why and what's going to be the result of those bloody conflicts. Is it going to in any way lead us beyond capitalism, or is it only going to keep us stuck in capitalism? Right? So why is this going to happen? Unavoidable, really. As much as we might want to avoid it, it's not really something that can be avoided. Right. It's inevitable.
Right.
We may not like it, but it's inevitable.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about why this thought is also forgotten. I mean, or these kind of analyses, let's say, because that's not the only idea that has been forgotten, obviously. I mean, Marx in 52, I think he wrote a letter where he clearly, I mean, at the time he hadn't written Capital, etc., but he basically says that this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was his only contribution to the communist thought. So he clearly thought that the idea is pretty significant, and you know, all the Marxists, most Marxists after him, like at least the big heroes that we know of, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, but even people like Stalin refer to this term, albeit with different interpretations, right? So skip forward a couple decades or 100 years, let's say, and nearly everybody that calls themselves a Marxist has basically completely abandoned this term. They don't talk about it anymore, and if it comes up, they kind of avoid it. It's pretty obvious that the term dictatorship of the proletariat does not really play a role anymore in the discourse. We don't discuss this. We don't have it as an utopian vision that we somehow need to figure out how that would work. And even in more elite Marxist circles in Germany, for example, it seems that people try to avoid this term. How did that happen? And I think now we're coming a little bit to this concept of the death of the left.
So, I mean, I guess I would say the split in Marxism that came with World War I between social democracy and communism, or between like socialism and communism, that's usually the way it's put, you know, played a huge role in this. And I think that it was raised earlier, violence, right? The question of violence. I think that revolution and reform have become associated with violence and nonviolence. And I don't think that's accurate or true. In other words, I think reform politics are often quite violent. And there's no particular reason why a revolution has to be violent. It might be, it's likely to be, but it's not in principle necessarily violent. And reform struggles also do not in any way necessarily avoid violence. They don't. So, in other words, you can have a great deal of violence that has nothing to do with trying to profoundly change society, right? So again, like Marxism became associated with a kind of extreme position, right? The sort of insistence on communism and by any means necessary, and we're going to force it through, right? And we're going to adopt violent methods because it's necessary or something. And that's a massive distortion of how Marxism understood these things, right? It's not like a choice. Like, are you willing to use violence? Are you willing to use undemocratic means? It's not a choice. It's not like I'm opting for that alternative, right? I'm not going to try to work through elections and reform processes and consent of the governed. I'm going to impose my political will on people to get us to socialism. That's not the point, right? So, again, I think that's the beginning of this problem, is that half of the Marxist left, the socialists, started to say, well, no, we don't support Bolshevism and communism, we don't support violent action, we don't support these undemocratic means and the use of force to achieve socialism. Right, so that's the beginning of the problem. And then it only got worse from there on. And I think that in the meantime, so that's like maybe negatively how the dictatorship of the proletariat got abandoned by a huge chunk of the working class movement for socialism through the social democratic and socialist left that opposed the Russian Revolution and opposed the Spartacus Bund and the communists in the German Revolution. The other part of it is the changing of the meaning of socialism, meaning it became associated with a kind of social democratic welfare state, especially in the Great Depression era. Right, so that was also a profound change because the socialists in the pre-World War I era were opposed to the welfare state. In other words, they didn't call for it, they didn't support it, they accepted it. In other words, if the capitalists want to give the working class things, fine, that's their business. But they didn't call for it, and they didn't necessarily support it either. In other words, welfare state provisions that were floated, they would vote against these things.
That's another fact that is so forgotten.
Yeah. Right? And so it's like, then socialism, so the welfare state came to be seen as like a step towards socialism, whereas originally Marxism and other socialists, like anarchists, of course, saw the welfare state as opposed to socialism, as the opposite of socialism, as a way of maintaining capitalism and disempowering and demobilizing and disorganizing the working class, which is, of course, what it is. That's what the welfare
stabilizing
state...
capitalism.
Stabilizing, but also as an anti-socialist measure. Bismarck came up with the welfare state as a way of fighting socialism, fighting against socialism. Right? So, and other people who were influenced by Bismarck, like the Webbs, the Fabians in the British Labour Party, right? They were self-consciously Bismarckian, right? They didn't want the dictatorship of the proletariat. They wanted the state to basically provide welfare provisions for the working class. And they were very much opposed to Marxism, to Marxian socialism, and also, of course, opposed to anarchism. And so, again, it was a very deliberate, from a Marxist perspective, anti-socialist measure, the welfare state. However, what happened in the Great Depression era is that people forgot that. And they didn't only forgot it, but they made sort of political calculations to obfuscate the issue. So originally, I like to say FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, was denounced by the socialists, the Socialist Party, and by the Communist Party. It was denounced as fascist. Now, they didn't mean Hitler fascism, they meant Mussolini fascism. They meant it as like a corporatist, capitalist state measure right, to control the working class. So the socialists and the communists both rejected the New Deal as fascist. Then the communists first, not the socialists, ironically, the communists decided that they were going to support the New Deal in order to align themselves with the progressive bourgeoisie against the threat of fascism. So they decided that they were going to support the progressive bourgeoisie and support the politics of the New Deal, support FDR and the Democratic Party in order to fight against the right. And we've been stuck there ever since.
And we are reliving that again. I mean,
Yep.
We've been talking about Sankara, right? So there's a question here. So you're talking about Bhaskar Sankara. He's, I think, the chief editor of Jacobin and now of The Nation.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Not the editor, the president of The Nation.
The president of The Nation, right.
Yeah.
And I will now quote from your text. But even to the extent that Sankara and his Jacobin comrades still claim to be not social democrats, but rather small d democratic socialists, and aspire for something greater than welfare state capitalism, they still base their vision on an earlier 20th century liquidation of Marxism and its goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I have two questions here. The first, if we were to sit down with Bhaskar now, and you know, maybe not on YouTube, maybe not online, maybe we have a beer with him, we're in private, so he can speak openly, and we would ask him a question that you like to ask sometimes, right? Are you for or against the dictatorship of the proletariat? Do we not think that he would answer yes? He
would say yes. He would qualify his answer by redefining what that means. So we've conducted a debate on this, but in a kind of indirect way that he didn't acknowledge that it was a debate. I gave a talk on Lenin's birthday, his 150th birthday, in 2020, on the relevance of Lenin today, and I criticized the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and Jacobin, and their theoretical perspective, as articulated by Vivek Chibber in his essay, Our Road to Power, which was meant to distinguish the DSA's vision from the old Marxist vision of Kautsky, who wrote the original Road to Power, and Lenin, and Luxemburg, and everyone else. And basically the perspective that they've adopted is that of Ralph Miliband, who was a socialist and was influenced by Marxism, and was a critic of the Labour Party in the UK in the post-World War II era. And, you know, was a serious political thinker, political philosopher, but explicitly, like, attacked the original Marxist vision, and he said that it was unrealistic. So the idea is that after the implementation of the 20th century welfare state, and with the expansion of democracy in a more substantial way, and with the rise of working class parties, like the Labour Party in the UK, but also like the SPD, that the original Marxist vision of revolution was no longer necessary, nor was it really possible, because the capitalist state had expanded its base of support, and it also wasn't desirable, right? It's not desirable to have a revolutionary smashing of the state and the implementation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That none of those things are likely to happen anymore, and we shouldn't want them to happen, and they're really not necessary to achieve socialism. Right, so the idea is that the way it's going to happen is through a kind of working class majority through the capitalist state, per se, and a gradual transition to socialism. Now, it claims to be different from the perspective of reformist social democracy before World War I, so the vision articulated by people like Eduard Bernstein. But the difference has to do with the supposed change of historical circumstance. How capitalism and the role of the state in capitalism and the role of working class political participation in the capitalist state had changed from the pre-World War I era, where the working class was mostly excluded, to the post-World War II era, in which capitalist governments rely on working class votes for their legitimacy, and in which working class parties are no longer seen as beyond the pale, but are really integral to support the capitalist state. So, however, interestingly, Miliband did not discount the possibility and even likelihood of a revolution anyway, right? But he thought it would be caused by the capitalists resisting change, right? So he thought that the working class, through its parties, should aim to achieve socialism through electoral means and through the expansion of the welfare state, but it should also be prepared if the capitalists should try to stop it by extra-parliamentary, illegal, unconstitutional means. Now, okay, so that's where today's DSA and Vivek Chibber and Bhaskar Sankara are not ready for that, because some people in the DSA do, but I don't think it's part of the Jacobin rhetoric to support things like the right to bear arms, like the working class being armed, which the working class was armed in Germany before World War I. The Social Democratic Party had its militias, right? The Socialist Party in the United States was armed and had its militias, you know. This is just, that's part of the history that's now been forgotten. And so, you know, again, they're not prepared really for what's necessary in a way that, and they're not arguing in favor of that either, right? Like, not at all, right? Because ultimately, their vision sort of brackets a profound crisis of the state, right? So again, you know, yeah, if we got Bhaskar drunk, he might say, well, sure, you know, but we're not there yet. Like, we're in the early stages of building, and you know, and so there's no point in talking about that now. There may not be a point to talking about that now. But I do think that some principles have to be established, right? And so the avoidance of that, especially over a long historical period, the consciousness has diminished. And there are many results of that. And again, like the choice to deliberately downplay certain things does have a corrosive effect for the possibility of any kind of future socialist movement or politics, right? If people, you know, I mean, my old comrades, the Trotskyists, the Spartacist League, right? They had a great phrase that's not original to them. The mask becomes the real face. Meaning, if the left wears a mask, pretends to be something other than what it is, that will become the real face. It will cease to be a mask.
There are two problems there. I mean, the first thing is that, right? So, okay, are you Bruce Wayne or are you Batman, right? So, and the second is, it's if it were the case, and some people were also talking about Sanders in that way. The idea that he knows, of course, and he wants the dictatorship of the proletariat. He wants socialism, but of course, in the U.S., this is not possible right now. And so he goes for the maximal thing that he can achieve, which is the social democracy, and we built on this, right? We built from there. So I feel this is highly problematic in the sense that if you address the people, like your constituency, the workers that you're trying to address with this kind of lie, that seems not, I mean, morally justifiable, but it's also, I think, organizationally is not plausible, because they will turn on you once they find out what you actually want to do, right?
And also because, you know, it might be the case that you might get more support for a more Civil War kind of footing, right? In other words, if you go to the working class and you say, you know what, to achieve the society that we need,
we're going to burn it down.
Yeah, I mean, or let's not even burn it down, right? Because, you know, again, like, if we think about it in the ancient Roman terms, you know, like, you know, the street fighting among the ruling families, you know, with their thugs or whatever, it didn't destroy society. It didn't. Now, in our society, of course, it can be radically disrupted by it's more delicate, it's more fragile than ancient Rome was. But, you know, again, it's just kind of like, look, the truth of the matter is profound change will be necessary. And there are people who will resist and who are going to do everything they can starting today to prevent socialism. They're doing it now. They will do it. At the first sign of socialism, they're going to slam it totally. And they're going to throw everything at it. Like they're going to arrest people. They're going to lock them up without trial. They're obviously going to ban you from social media. They're going to do everything, right? And so, understand why and how that is. And, it doesn't mean that you want to set yourself up for that. The old socialists were very good at doing what's necessary, but not getting caught, not breaking the law, or at least not get caught doing it. And, they had their underground, organizing. They had very sophisticated ways of building the movement without provoking the state to repress them. And that's really politics. And that's the left. The left is dead because the left does none of that. It does absolutely none of that at all. And it doesn't even pretend that it wants to or could do that. Like, I guess there are some people who have more of there are anarchists, of course, and then there are other people, maybe some tankies, some Marxist-Leninists who might have some, guerrilla warfare kind of notion or people's war kind of idea. Not really, though. That's more of a pose. They're not prepared to actually do it. They're not.
That's like a LARP.
Yeah, totally. Right? And, and so I do feel like, I've been dealing with young people now through Platypus for the last 15 years. And, you just have to sit down with people and just say, look, this ain't pretty, but this is reality. And, this is what you have to get your head wrapped around. You have to kind of see things for what they really are, understand, and prepare yourself. And also prepare yourself for it's going to take decades to build up to the point where we can overcome capitalism. And in the meantime, we can't be terrorized by the latest right-wing election or the latest law that's being passed that has horrible effects. And, oh, what about abortion? What about immigrants? What about this? What about... We can't do anything about that. We cannot do anything about that. And don't be manipulated by the capitalist politicians. Don't be terrorized. We're going to have to survive capitalism and all of its brutality. We're going to have to learn how to deal with things and not think that the world is going to end if this candidate is elected instead of that candidate is elected. No, the world's not going to end. It's not. If I could snap my fingers and we'd be 100 years from now, the world is not going to be over. Climate change, nuclear war, we might have flooding, we might have nuclear war, of a limited scale. The world will still be there. Humans will still be living in capitalism 100 years from now. It's not going to be this catastrophic end. It's not the end of the world's not happening in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. No, right? So just deal with the fact that this is a brutal society with a lot of oppression, a lot of suffering. We can't do anything about it now except try to build up to the point where we might be able to make a change in the future. And you may not see it but do what's necessary now so that maybe 100 years from now, people aren't still dealing with the same problems we're dealing with now.
Right. And I think also this question that you normally ask, I already hinted at it, this idea, you come into a podcast, I think it was with Doug Lane, and you sit him down and you say, okay, Doug, are you with me in bringing about the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And it seems like most people on the left, if you explain it also like you did now, they would agree to it. And they would it's kind of a romantic idea, right? This concept of the rulership of the working class. It has something invigorating. But I imagine also that you ask it because something else, because it feels a little bit, at least to me, like you are actually hinting at the fact that this dictatorship of the proletariat, bringing about that dictatorship and also the dictatorship itself, will maybe be painful. Painful change will require sacrifice, hardship, and that we should be getting ready for that. Do I get that right?
The idea being that it actually won't necessarily be a hardship beyond what we already have to suffer in capitalism, right? Obviously, in places like the United States and Western Europe, we can have some decades of relative social peace, but there's a lot of hidden suffering. There's a lot of like hidden violence, like structural violence, whatever you want to call it. I mean, obviously, the left knows about these things, but it usually talks about those things in terms of the condition of like minorities, racial minorities, women, and, like other subaltern people, like gay people, like how they quietly suffer and die in this brutal system. Or in the United States, incarcerated people, obviously there's a massive incarceration of the lumpen proletariat in the United States. That's very brutal. And so you can get a kind of notion of like structural racism or structural sexism, but you seldom have the ability for people to face squarely capitalism, right? That this is just a reality. And, it's usually rendered kind of invisible, or when it is rendered visible, it's only rendered visible in certain ways. So we only see it in certain terms. We see it as like the plight of the immigrants, or, like we see it in a way that can be kind of exoticized and romanticized and kind of marginalized. And so it's, again, it's not like get yourself ready for suffering. It's like, what's the meaning of the suffering now? Like what, why are we suffering now? What would it take to actually change that? And to be serious about it, like to be, really thinking, because like I said before, dictatorship of the proletariat, okay. The jury is still out, at best. The jury is still out on that one, right? It's not like we can say, commit to this and it will all work out. No. It's politics, it's a risk, it's a gamble, it's a danger. And maybe the revolution will make things worse, not better. Maybe capitalism can't be overcome, who knows, maybe. But, again, there will be civil wars, there will be revolutions, there will be international wars. That's guaranteed. And again, we've had a couple of generations of people who kind of got through their lives without those things. Maybe the first generation in a long time that experienced that, right? People born after World War II and living until now in Western Europe and the United States have lived through a time when there haven't been civil wars and revolutions. That's over. That's over, right? I don't think the millennial or Zoomer generation will live a whole lifetime without civil war and revolution in their countries. I don't think so. So, again, what's going to be the result of that? So in the original generation of Marxism, in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, that generation saw a lot. They saw a lot of international war, civil war, revolution, Franco-Prussian War, Paris Commune, American Civil War, Russo-Japanese War, 1905 Revolution. They saw a lot in their lifetime. And then eventually they saw World War I and the revolutions that came out of that. And so they didn't have the illusions that we have, that somehow you can avoid this, right? And you can just sort of improve things a little bit and just make things a little bit better and gradually overcome all these iniquities, injustice and brutality in the system. That's an illusion. It's a bad illusion. And again, people outside the metropolitan countries, they know, right? Everyone outside of Western Europe and the United States, they know, right? And it's an international world now. I mean, look, there are immigrant communities who have that experience, right? Who have fled, right? And maybe they are looking for the Disneyland life of Western Europe, and that's fine too. Everyone doesn't have to be a revolutionary and hardcore, political warrior. But again, it's kind of like, yeah. So I didn't mean that kind of question to Doug Lane, like, do you support the dictatorship of the proletariat? It was more like a thought question. It was less of a moral kind of question of like, commit, be willing to do what's necessary, make the sacrifice. It was more about like, do you understand that that's the prospect? Like, do you understand this is where it's all going? right? If you think of yourself as a socialist, if you think of yourself as a Marxist, even if, like, look, even if you have a parliamentary road to socialism, Ralph Miliband, Bhaskar Sankara, Vivek Chibber, and the DSA, let's say the DSA were successful, that they become the left wing of the Democratic Party, and they organize the American working class, the rank and file strategy. Let's say that it all works out. At the end of that road is going to come a civil war.
There is the big boss waiting.
Yeah.
Yep.
And also along the way, there's going to be that. But even if it all works out smoothly and not any kind of real horror along the way, that's not very likely. But let's say that happens. At the end of the road is still going to be a civil war. It's still going to be a revolution. And so is the DSA building itself up? Are these young people being recruited to something? Are they being organized? Are they being educated to be ready? No. And plus, they're not even in that, meaning at the end of the day,
right,
10 years from now, they'll just be regular Democrats, and they'll be right-wing Democrats who are opposed by other like left-wing Democrats of a new generation.
Right.
That's all.
We've seen that before. I mean, that's ultimately also the vibe that I get from this. And this is my last question. Now, maybe you can close it up. Then it's a little bit about like if you try to reflect on where Marxism or the communist movement came from. And Stefan said something in the interview last week where he said, like, yeah, there are all these heroes. There's Lenin, there's Luxemburg, there's Trotsky, all these great people, and all of them failed. Like, get that in your head, that if you want to bring about communism, you need to be better than them. And then we see this huge disconnect from where they were and where we are today. And I can't help but feel pretty hopeless at times, to be honest. And I wonder, maybe a little bit of a personal question, because you obviously much more steeped into all of this, right? You teach, you agitate, you organize for communism in this sense. What does give you hope? Like, why are you still doing this? Why are you not throwing in the towel and saying, okay, this is not going anywhere. Let's just enjoy our lives.
Well, we should enjoy our lives anyway, right? Like, this should never get in the way of enjoying life.
Yes, I agree.
It's really important. You got to enjoy this life while you're living it. So I would say I'm not motivated by hope exactly. I'm motivated by duty, right? And it's a complex duty that I feel called to perform, meaning that I was a leftist in my youth. You know, as an adolescent, as a high school student, as a college student, an undergraduate student, I was a leftist, and I was very enthusiastic and very idealistic, and I wanted revolution now, and let's do this, and I wanted to work with people who are serious about that, and, you know, but then I had to see that, okay, it's not really happening. And so I withdrew from politics, but I maintained my Marxism. And I think that I certainly taught Marxism as a young college professor, as a young instructor. And, you know, I taught it as an idea. I taught it as like a classic idea, you know, like. And then, you know, the millennial generation, those were my students, they reached for Marxism. They became interested in Marxism. And they asked me to teach them what it's really about, right? So, in other words, I could sort of present certain ideas in the classroom, be kind of equivocal about it, and be like, oh, you know, isn't this an interesting idea? Right? But then they came to me outside of class, and they were like, okay, what does this really mean? Like, seriously, like, tell us, what does this mean? And if they hadn't done that, maybe I would not have done this, what I've done, right? If someone hadn't said, we want to know, and, you know, and it just, okay, you want to know? I actually know. I know. I can tell you, right? And it may not be for you. You may not like it. But if you want to know, I'll teach you. I will. And then, you know, and they also said, well, there are all these Marxists out there, right? What the hell? What are they about? And I had to say, oh, you know, well, they're kind of artifacts of the death of the left. right? They're the kind of flotsam and jetsam. They're the kind of refuse of history. They're the kind of wreckage, the debris of the failure of historical Marxism, and that they've all found ways of rationalizing that failure, right? And kind of changing what Marxism meant in order to rationalize that failure. And so be careful, because actually that's not really Marxism. It's more like a kind of strange echo of Marxism, but distorted. Right, so I had a sense of duty, which is a duty to, like, the truth, which is, right or wrong, we can say what Marxism is and what it isn't, actually, and we can show how it's been warped, distorted, falsified, turned to other purposes, used for to rationalize other forms of politics, to not pursue the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the political party that would be necessary, or parties that would be necessary, because maybe there'll be competing parties, competing socialist parties in the revolution. Fine, that's great. The more the merrier. That's desirable. And so, understand that this is the proposition. And if Marx still, and Marxism, this history, exercises a kind of an appeal, a fascination, a curiosity, right? Probably that has a real basis in society and in reality. Meaning, if Marxism, if these ideas still resonate, it's probably because they're still relevant. They still apply. They still express something real about our society and our moment in history. That there's a truth there. And therefore, probably in the future, people will dust off these books again, or find it on the Internet Archive or something, right? They will reach for they'll be like, yeah, what was that Marxism about again? What was, And therefore, there's a duty to be true to that, right? And also to think about, how does it apply to our time? How, if it resonates, how does it resonate? What are we grasping? And yeah, it seems like kind of a reach. We're reaching back to the 1800s, and we're using these obscure terms. Dictatorship of the proletariat, what the hell is that? Right? But there's something. There is something. It will be remembered, and it deserves to be remembered in its truth. And that's a complex proposition, but still, there's like a duty, there's a task. There's an obligation. For those of us who know something about this, there's an obligation. Right? And so I'm not motivated by hope exactly, because I don't think there's a concrete basis for hope for me in the way there was for, like, Lenin or for Marx and Engels, or Luxemburg for that matter, that she was confident that, the struggle will continue. I'm not confident, because the struggle is over. The struggle ceased and needs to be restarted, reconstituted in some profound way. For socialism, obviously people struggle. They do. They fight within the system. But specifically the struggle for socialism, that's been abandoned. But there's still a kind of a attraction to that. And so my sense is that, again, though concretely I can't say, oh, see, it's possible, I still know that the truth of these ideas comes through and deserves a sincere, honest advocate.
Excellent. Chris, that was a great ending, last word, I would say. I want to thank you a lot for being here. That was really delightful, and I hope you will come back later. Maybe we'll talk about something more concrete, maybe something, current politics or something like that in a couple of months or so.
Great. Mm-hmm.
All right. I will now turn on the outro. Please don't run away immediately. I just have one more question in the off then after I stop the stream, okay? And then everybody else who was here and saw this, thanks for watching. And please follow Chris Cutrone you can find him, I think, on Facebook, but you can also find him on platypus1917.org. He writes there also regularly. I will link this, of course, in the description. So make sure you check out Platypus. Also, guys, folks in Germany, you can do that too. They have a couple of groups in Germany, as you might know. If you haven't seen the video with Stefan Hein yet, please go and look at that. Okay, and with that, we are out.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.